Hi, I'm Phil Howard, and this is the latest installment of our Media and Change series at the Center for Media, Data and Society. My guest today is Sharath Srinivasan from Cambridge University. Welcome.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, it's great to be here.
So you're one of the world's experts on media and political change in East Africa, and I was going to ask you about how technology has changed Africa, but I suppose I should also ask how Africa's changed technology. Right?
Indeed, yeah. Well, it's a good point. I think that the nature of technology, especially digital communications technology and software innovation, etc., is that it can happen anywhere at any time. It's quite easy. The initial costs for that kind of innovation are much lower than they would be in previous ages with previous technologies. So there is a lot of innovation coming out of Africa. We see Ushahidi, for example, the crowd-sourced crisis mapping platform, Mixit, M-Pesa, the mobile money platform again. So lots of exciting things. Africa, in that sense, yes, as with many other parts of the world, is really, I think, reshaping the way we think about technologies and their possibilities. On the side of how technology is reshaping Africa, certainly in terms of my research and interests, there's certainly a lot of buzz and hype and interest around the latest innovations, the latest apps, the latest software tools, etc. But if we think about sub-Saharan Africa writ large and the real development and governance challenges that affect a large swathe of the populations in these countries, especially around issues of poverty and involvement and inclusion in politics. The way that technology is reshaping Africa is less about the fancy new stuff. It's more about a mixture of existing platforms, channels that have grown, especially in the last 20 years. Think about radio, television, combining those platforms with the mobile phone in particular, which is perhaps the biggest game changer, as we know.
Right.
But it's these combinations of technologies, new and old, media, new and old, that I think is perhaps where the most profound change is happening.
And to me, this has always been one of the most exciting things about your work, the way you can integrate SMS systems into a way of gathering information on a public problem, collective action problem, or a public health problem, and produce data that then feeds back to the people who need solutions.
Yeah, and there's some great, in that sense, great innovations around that we've worked for many years now with the team behind Frontline SMS, which is a low cost, zero cost for some of their tools platform, open source, really focused on grassroots organizations. And the original idea for them was that you can't afford to be reliant on the internet. You need to make this something that's easy and flexible and portable that can be used in all sorts of settings where the infrastructure, the power connections, etc., are not as ideal as we'd like them to be. And once you start going and you create communications hubs using these kinds of technologies, all sorts of new things become possible. There are new affordances for organizations working with district healthcare workers, for communities and citizens to engage in evaluating and feeding back on development initiatives, etc. And in our work, we've really focused on those kinds of possibilities. And one of the things I think that's really important is that you have to start with a reality check. If you're really interested in the greater population that is affected by challenges of poverty and lack of development, you have to look at what's there and available for them now. And as I said, when we look at mobile phone and radio, for example, as a combination, it's a powerful one because radio, a really important medium of information and knowledge development for African communities, suddenly becomes a bit more two-way. People are able to phone in, to text into radio shows, and to be recognized, so their texts get read out on air or their calls are taken. And it's that process of creating new, in a sense, public spaces, mediated ones, they're not necessarily always ideal, but new public spaces that enables new possibilities, because you can get a discussion going, people can text in and have a view, and that text data in particular is something that one can then subsequently look at and, in a sense, understand the trends, the core themes, and then amplify that towards other actors, towards governance actors, etc. Yeah.
Is your sense, so I imagine there are many Africas, yeah? Is your sense that the kinds of innovations you're describing tend to start in Lagos, or start in Kenya and start in Nigeria and move across the continent from there? Or are there particular points of innovation that you could locate on the continent?
Yeah, I think when it comes to the higher end stuff, I guess the smartphone-based apps, some of the software, internet-based tools and platforms, you'll see that Kenya, Nairobi's iHub, for example, Nigeria, South Africa, obviously, are countries where a lot of ideas are emanating from and then spreading out. But I think it's equally true that there's a lot of innovation that occurs not necessarily in these sorts of innovation hubs, but occurs just across the continent. It's much more localized, and you have to look for it and find it, but it does occur. And they can be really powerful things like radio and mobile phone infrastructures that are connected to very local power grids, or that are people innovating with mobile health data, for example, in a rural part of Zambia. That they've got a problem they need to fix, and someone comes up with an idea, and the relative ease of actually coming up with ideas that work is what makes these technologies quite interesting.
That's interesting, because so much of the buzz around big data, say, in the developed world is often also about cities, right? About smart cities.
Yeah.
And so we might assume that innovation really originates in Africa's largest cities, because that's where the connectivity is. Perhaps that's where the densest slums are, and that the rural zones might have to wait for sort of technology-driven innovations. But it sounds like that's not true.
Well, I think that's true to an extent, but I guess it depends what counts as innovation in a sense. And so, in a sense, the most advanced, technically advanced and sophisticated innovations are going to occur in cities and in city contexts. And certainly when it comes to big data, to the Internet of Things, you see that very much being driven from cities out. That's where the capital and the infrastructure and the human capacity, etc., is concentrated. But I think innovation isn't at all about high-end technical advancement necessarily. Innovation is, I think, about social and contextual processes in which ideas are brought through that can change social and material realities and behaviors. And their technology can play a critical role in that, but it's actually the wider context of what the problem is, what the challenge is, what the opportunity is, and how to design around that that is vital. What's, I think, particularly interesting, if we broaden our horizons and imagination of innovation, is how innovative some of the things that are going on in all parts of the continent, city, country, some of the pioneer countries and some of those is behind, that's just going on at largely decentralized levels. So yeah, I mean, there are a litany of different examples of this, but I think that broader view of innovation turns up lots of different new things when we look for it.
And I imagine the region got a big boost out of the undersea trunk cables that started arriving really only in the last 3 or 4 years.
3 or 4 years,
to Dar es Salaam and cities up and down the coast.
Yeah.
Having that sort of fat pipe connection to the rest of the world must help attract innovative thinking. Right? Yeah,
I think that's really been a big game changer. You see it in Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, Uganda, that especially the littoral countries, the seaboard ones, it's had a huge effect, and it's creating a lot of other possibilities around it. There are always the challenges, I think, that sort of the underlying core logics of that have largely been driven by commercial priorities and realities. So there are good things and bad things that I think have resulted from a particular dominant sort of commercial logic to the way that broadband has come to that part of the world. But it has opened up an enormous amount of possibilities, there's no doubt.
So I was under the impression, I hope you'll correct me if I'm wrong, I was under the impression that West Africa's experience with internet development was highly commercialized. There was a series of French firms and American firms who brought the internet to West Africa as a commercial venture, and pricing access at just slightly below the cost of satellite access, so that it was not as it was not as cheap as it could be. And I thought East Africa was doing something different, that they were publicly and collectively managing this new infrastructure.
Yeah.
Did that story play out, or
Yeah, I mean,
essentially has it become a commercial?
I mean, it plays out to the point of, I think, the access arriving in country at a core level, and that creates wholesale prices for commercial operators that are much more attractive and much more, I think, and that certainly is a big difference with West Africa. Thereafter, I think the story changes quite a bit, because I think once it, again, I think the burning questions are about the 70 to 80% of the population that you really know this should change their lives, and for them, the intermediaries that are involved for them to get access, or for relevant products and services to get to them based on that access, are still largely driven by commercial logic. I mean, that there's nothing particularly new in that, but it does bear upon these questions which concern me, which is, so what for development and governance for the larger majority of the population. Yeah. So huge innovation, huge possibilities, huge new inventive developments, but within these constraints that exist in terms of how that reaches the population writ large.
So one of the inventive developments you mentioned earlier is M-Pesa. And I think Africa, many of the countries of Africa, certainly sub-Saharan Africa, have been difficult to study as a social scientist, because so much of their economy is not currency-based. It's so difficult to measure the transactions that happen outside of the formal economy. We know the remittances are an enormous part of economic life, and we know there are economic exchanges that don't involve currency, and M-Pesa has been important, right, for helping to extend the ability of people to spend and save in ways that don't actually seem to involve the government.
Yeah.
Is M-Pesa is it a rival governance institution in a sense? Is it just a bank? Right?
Yeah.
Or has it become more?
Well, I mean, even just being a bank is a big deal, because of course it's it's
banking the unbanked.
Yeah, but it's run by a telecommunications company, so the very idea of it being a bank is not uncontroversial. In effect, it is a bank, and it has a close relationship with large banks in terms of the way that the model that it operates on. It has, I think, been a real game changer, both for the existing financial services industry and for the government in thinking about where power lies now. And I think the government in Kenya in particular has come to grips with that over time and tried to engage and negotiate its relationship with this large and growing sector. A huge amount of financial transactions now take place over M-Pesa, and the volume or the value of that on a yearly basis is astounding compared to the GDP of the country. It's really large. So with that comes an enormous amount of power, and with that also an enormous amount of risk and systemic, in effect, risk that transactions which rely on M-Pesa are so many and so frequent that a problem with that platform becomes a risk for the economy as a whole. But also issues to do with security and money laundering and all of that suddenly become a concern of a telecommunications company, which is not something that they would as much be used to dealing with. So I think this has on the one hand had a huge effect on the way that the political and financial landscape of the country is sort of reoriented around these new large corporations and their sort of weight that they carry. So M-Pesa and Safaricom are also moved into other sectors. We have sort of savings and loans, M-Shwari. There's the new initiative around off-grid solar energy, M-Copa, which is also a really interesting model. With all of this comes an ability for these institutions to do things like understand the credit history and credit status of individuals, and to be able to combine different data points on different kinds of uses of different kinds of transactions.
On trustworthiness.
And trustworthiness, exactly, on consumer spending patterns, etc. So enormous knowledge assets that are developed out of these capabilities, and they do rival the capability of knowledge
from a credit
production
agency,
of credit agencies, but also of the government in a sense. Like, so you might find in a sense that Safaricom knows more about the Kenyan population in effect through its data than the government does, because it's dealing with the population on a daily basis and the government isn't.
Or second to second.
Indeed, and second to second. So there are, I think, some really interesting questions around the sort of monopoly over information in a sense that is produced out of these new platforms, and the consequence of that in terms of knowledge-power relations, I suppose. Yeah.
So, in terms of political economy, what would you want to see if M-Pesa is essentially formalizing the informal sector, or expanding the amount of data we have on social transactions? Is that wealth of data something that you would want the government to have access to? I mean, is this an opportunity to expand the tax base through technology, or do you think it's best left called an informal sector?
I don't think it's best left called an informal sector. I think that's too risky. I think what the role of the government is with relating to it, whether it's in terms of regulation or access or being able to build upon these platforms, I think is a complex question. I mean, I don't think it's easily answered. I do think that you get to a point where the public goods start to emerge in this space that need to be understood as public goods, and that requires, I think, a response from government. Now, whether the government's best placed and willing and able to deal with them as public goods and not as opportunities for other forms of sort of rent extraction is another question. But it does get to a point where too much becomes dependent on for people's everyday lives and their quality of life on these platforms and these processes and services, that the government can just step away from them and look at them as if they're just in the informal economy. I think the other thing that is important is to understand what kinds of lock-ins occur for citizens in these kinds of on these kinds of platforms. So what opportunity really is there for competition to emerge that could drive down the transaction costs? Because the transaction costs are quite significant for the ordinary Kenyan, and especially for poorer segments of the population.
So you mean the transaction costs of moving value out of M-Pesa as a platform into some other platform?
Sorry, no, this is less the transaction costs from the sort of market industry perspective, but more literally the costs of transacting on M-Pesa, which increasingly is the way that Kenyans have to do many different things, and it's the point, I guess, is just that the fees involved are not trivial when seen from the point of view of ordinary Kenyans. So clearly there has to be an opportunity for greater competition and to think about the consequence of this, because in effect what's happening is whereas if you had currency and you had banking that was in some senses driven by a public good mentality, the use of the currency would not cost you any money. It would be something that's provided. It's a public good. In effect, what's potentially happening is that is not the case. And every time it's a private currency, and every time you're doing something and transacting, you're paying a fee. Now, that's all convenient and well and good up to a point, and then it becomes quite a pernicious erosion of public goods for society at large. So I think there are real questions, but is the whole thing going in the direction of more public goods and more protected and stable public goods? No, that's not the world we live in. The likelihood is that the only alternative is to come in to break monopolistic practices, and not to say not that I would say that M-Pesa necessarily is doing that, but that's the risk that lies.
The risk,
and one effort to break that by a bank in Kenya called Equity Bank, which tried to go into telecommunication services to make the reverse move, has proven to be very much caught and enmeshed in a complex political economy of the state and big corporations. So the game is quite political.
It's a tough game.
It's a tough game.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, you currently work in the UK, which is a country with politicians who are quite aggressively advocating the use of technology, social media, to help monitor national security issues. Are governments in sub-Saharan Africa starting to think the same way about social media as a source of intelligence?
Yeah.
Or are they slow to get there?
No, I don't think they're slow at all. I think one of the things to remember about many but not all of the governments in sub-Saharan Africa is that the protection of the regime's stability and its longevity is a vital concern. So security is sort of an existential question for the regimes and the governments themselves, and not one that they're easily in control of because their monopolies over violence and their kind of understanding and intelligence of the population is limited by the constraints that they face. So on the one hand you have this deep hardwired concern around security that relates to the regime stability itself. On the other hand, you have this new opportunity that comes from these new information communication technologies. So many governments are very much interested in how to make most use of that. And many of these states are also involved in complex transnational crises of instability and insecurity, and so thus Western countries and other countries are also involved in helping them to better use the monitoring of social media and other data to advance security.
Okay, so when Snowden taught us about how much the American government does, and as we've learned about what GCHQ can do, how have African governments responded? I mean, it sounds like they collaborate, but must have also been surprised in some way at the depth of monitoring that their citizens undergo from foreign governments. Right?
Yes, I mean, I think they might be surprised, but I don't think they'd be shocked. I mean, they might be surprised because they didn't realize the depth of it, but I don't think it comes as a great travesty and injustice necessarily, because these are often governments that are desperately trying to do something similar, but at a much lower tech
so they're grateful for any sharing of intelligence. Of
intelligence, yeah. So I mean, there's a lot of intelligence sharing. If I think of the countries I know better, but Kenya, Ethiopia, Tanzania. There's a lot of intelligence sharing with the West because of concerns around Islamist, radical Islamist elements in Somalia and elsewhere. So there's been long-standing intelligence sharing, and then coming into that now has been increasing collaboration around data analysis, and that's both been on social media, but telecommunications data, etc. So those sorts of transfers of expertise and capability and skills are, I think, going on. Not always in ways that are easily discernible, but there are indications of it at different points in time. And in Kenya, for example, around the Westgate attacks and thereafter, there was a clear engagement by the security and intelligence institutions of Western countries to support the Kenyan government thereafter in trying to firm up its ability to monitor the movement of various people and their communications. So this is very much a live topic, and we see this, in things like also monitoring of social media around hate speech, around elections. Sometimes the initial reason for collaboration on these issues or focus on them is perfectly important and credible and justified. In Kenya, there was a real attention to the problem of hate speech online around the 2013 elections, and real interest from the government to actually keep a monitor on this and to act as well. In order to do that, capabilities are built, and those capabilities are transferred also into other spheres.
Say more about elections. I remember seeing a study about internet use in Tanzania that said the people who were using the internet more were more likely to be engaged in politics, but also be more cynical. And I've seen other research on Nigeria that suggests that the social media in particular is not certainly a positive thing because it feeds the Nigerian political culture of rumors.
Yeah.
And I think this is a phenomenon perhaps we don't have in the West. It's the crazy rumors about candidates having two heads or palaces made of gold. So it's the outrageous rumors that seem to have real life in the Nigerian political sphere because social media doesn't police content the same way. What would you say about how media use has changed in the last few years? And
yeah, I mean, there are a few points there. They're all really interesting. I think that on the question of information access and political agency and involvement and involvement in elections or cynicism towards politics and all, I think we're so far behind trying to really understand the causal relationships here that I think we have to be really wary. One thing, just as the point, it's distinct from the question, but we have to be really wary that the problem is information access, and that more information and better information makes for better citizenship and better politics, and that is something that we've come to understand in the West. It might not be true. Yet it completely infects the logic of thinking about political development and democratization in Africa. There's a huge amount that goes into this idea, this causal question. On the broader question of, well, what role does social media have in, I think, amplifying and exaggerating something which already goes on, especially in Nigeria, but also in other countries. And Nigeria is really well known for this phenomenon of storytelling and street rumor, and it's the place it has. There are a lot of interesting things going on there. I mean, first, I think that we already know, in the case of Western democracies, that conspiracy is flourishing because of social media. And just recently, a senior British politician, Douglas Alexander, addressing the Labour Party conference, said that one of the biggest threats to democracy is these kinds of conspiracies and rumours that go around. And so after the Scottish referendum, there was a big conspiracy that the vote count was rigged, and 100,000 people signed a petition, or different ways in which people are getting their information from social media and then acting on it and mobilising around it, not always exercising political judgment. Right? This is certainly one of the real challenges of our age, a surfeit of information and communication and participation, but not necessarily the space and context of judgment and
processing time.
And processing time, exactly.
I think, yeah.
So that's all. I think what's common for us all. The fact that in Nigeria it becomes inflected with existing cultural practices and forms of talking about politics, of talking about public life, which are prone to weird exaggerations for what we find hard to understand why anyone would actually take this seriously. I think is to miss the fact that these are codes, right? These are codes in which people understand their reality that mean something to them based on the world in which they live in, and they're not necessarily. They have a force. It's not that they're not taken literally. They seem to have a literal force, but the literal force is something that we find very hard to understand and interpret, and so. Maybe it's just the same thing going on, really. It's one way of understanding it, that it's taken forms that were, in a sense, on the street or offline, as we sometimes used to think about it. And it's taken them online, it's exaggerated them, it's increased its circulation. That's exactly what's happened in our democracies, is that more conspiracies about UFOs or plots, etc., that were always there, have become exaggerated and have a life of their own, even more so because of the ease of communications that this technological revolution has brought. So I always think one has to be very wary of seeing essential difference in parts of Africa, and actually we learn a lot about loyalty, about quote unquote. Tribalism, around rumour, around gossip, around the ways in which politics is structured around clientelism and patronage. And we learn a lot about ourselves and our own democracies through understanding some of the ways in which African politics works.
I suppose the important lesson is that there's going to be more diversity in what democracy is, right? There's probably no sensible archetype of an American democracy or a Scandinavian democracy, and that, if anything, technology allows for some diversity in how democratic practices are developed.
I think that's that's the optimistic hope in an age where we've lost a sense of what democracy ever was, really, and what seemed like was a relatively stable concept was never probably as stable as that anyway, but certainly feels much less graspable in the age in which we live. And the idea that actually this is not so bad, it's a flourishing of many wonderful different ideas of democracy, I think may have merits, but I personally am wary of of this, because I think we have to retain some of the core fundamental ideas of democracy. Above all, the idea that publics and that spaces that are public in which people talk about politics matter, and that networked sort of sub-communities around issues that come together and act and then dissipate. All of these other ways in which we think democracy might, rediscover or reinvent itself are fine to a point, but I think fundamentally some of the basic material and social conditions of life, of human life, are quite the same still. And the idea that we can
and you're also
tackle
speaking of human rights here. So freedom of expression and the freedom of assembly, these things
really, of course,
are still constants.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, they're constants, but we also we have to find the spaces where they matter. It's very hard to talk about freedom of expression or human rights without the public spaces where they're legitimated and validated and made real and practiced. So we could erode a lot more than just some ideas of democracy if we start to lose a sense that we still have to find the spaces where we come together and actually make judgments, debate, discuss, contest what's right or what's wrong. And if that fragments so far in sort of a networked digital age, to the point that we just are really sitting there doing this all through our phones or our computer screens, I'm not confident that we recover an idea of democracy that's worth recovering at all. Yeah.
Well, thank you for visiting today.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, I really enjoyed it.
My guest today has been Sharath Srinivasan from Cambridge University. Thank you.
Thanks.